Okay. All right. Welcome, everybody. It is our October Special Education Parent Advisory Group meeting, and our presentation today is on restorative practices, shifting from why to what happened. My name is Steve Fideldi. I'm the Director of Special Services and Counseling here in the Franklin Lakes Public Schools. I'm also, now I can finally say, a proud graduate of the International Institute for Restorative Practices. So I got my master's degree from there this past spring. And it is truly, with like 100+ graduate credits, it is the one program that I would keep going back to time and time again, even if I didn't get a degree, and continue to have to pay for it. It was absolutely changed my philosophy as an educator and as a parent and as a spouse as well. So what we're going to be talking about is how can we apply restorative practices to the home? And before we jump in, I like to just give a quick background. When we talk about restorative practices, what are they? And when we talk about restorative practices, we're talking about how we develop community, how we establish connection, and in doing so, how do we leverage that to repair harm when harm occurs? So you can imagine all of the different avenues that this could be applied to. I have books over here, people who are here in person. And you'll see that there are some books over here regarding grading, like Pointless from Sarah Zerwin. Talks about how we can collaboratively work on grading. There's books about the Black church, about community and faith, and how that has been such an important pillar of the community. You'll see a lot of the books are also based on indigenous roots, because that's where restorative practice comes from. It comes from the practices of indigenous people that say our value comes on the uniqueness of us getting together and everyone's individual perception and point of view, and really honoring the wisdom that everyone brings to the table. So it's important to honor the fact that this is a practice that came from those indigenous people. So I want you to think about, I've got 3 kiddos at home. I want you to think about, you come home and your kids are doing something completely ridiculous, and you walk in on them, and think about the first words and the tone that come to your mind. And I'll give you a story real briefly. We had just renovated our house because Julia was born, our youngest. So the ranch didn't have enough room at the inn for the dog, the 3 kids, and the 2 of us. And one of my kids, who will not be named because this is being recorded, decided that during their sleepover, they would write on the wall with invisible ink with their friend, but yet that invisible ink was written with a ballpoint pen. So you can imagine what happened in the sheetrock, that we now had the indentation of their magical transcriptions. And as a parent, the first thing that I end up saying is, why'd you do that? It's that exacerbated, why would you do that? And I want you to think about that initial reaction that we have when we ask the question, why? As a parent, to your partner, to your spouse, to your loved ones, have you ever asked a question to someone who's done something that's upset you and say, why did you do that? And actually get a meaningful answer? And I see some people smirking. The answer is probably not. And one thing we'll talk about through today's presentation is when we ask that why question, it creates shame and it pushes that person farther away from us rather than pulling them in. So today's presentation is about how at home we can speak to our kiddos and change some language. So restorative practice isn't a curriculum. There's no like, lesson 1, 2, 3, or 4. It's really about small micro movements on how we approach each other and the language we use to more effectively call each other into community rather than using language that pushes us out from community. And we know when it comes to kids with special needs that they're more at risk of being pushed out of community than they are being called back in. This is a quote I have up here from Costello and Wachell, and it's really just talking about, when it comes to education in general and educational philosophy, we've always done things in a certain way, but when it comes to the use of restorative practices, it allows us to perhaps take a different path forward and try something different. One of the suggestions I heard at a conference was beautiful, and you all as parents have sat through back to school nights. And back to school nights usually a list of the curriculum we're using, what the kids' schedule is, what supplies they need, and make sure you contribute to the PTO. There's no community building. right? As a blended family, when Tess and Nate moved in and they went into kindergarten and second grade, all the families knew each other. I didn't know anyone. So I'm sitting in this absent of community, and I've been absent of the community for the past 6 years. But imagine if that back to school night, we turned towards each other and said, I want you to get to know the other kids in your class, the other families in your class, and I want to help build connections so we can help support each other. That would be much more worth my time than something that could come out on a one-page flyer of the schedule and the curriculum. So it's just requiring us to look at things a little bit differently and try things in a new direction. When we talk about what we'll cover briefly in today's presentation, it's these 4 pillars of restorative practices that essentially does everything that Facebook said it would do when it first came out. And it's talking about how we can affect change by working with each other, how we implement fair process, how we understand student shame, and the restorative continuum. I'm playing around here with my single screen of having to hide this so the people here can see, but I will walk you through it and I can share the presentation as well. But the social discipline window is this idea that people are more likely to come together and be cooperative and buy in when things are done with them rather than to or for them. So you can think of this at home when it comes to consequences, right? If a kid needs to do some chores and they have an assignment and they don't do it, you could punish them and do something to them, right? Go to your room because you didn't clean the dishes. You could do something for them, do it yourself, or you could do something with them. And when you look at that with them, what does that look like? It's calling them in and saying, like, Lindsay, I know that your job is to clean the dishes and they haven't really got done yet. Going back to my family, mom and the other kids are upstairs. Do you think this is something we could tackle together to really help the family? Because I could really use this help. You're calling them in rather than pushing them out. IEP meetings, and I think this is something we talked about in the beginning of our presentation, how as a district, we've shifted from parents coming to IEP meetings and feeling like decisions were being made to them or for them, and they didn't feel like it was that collaborative sense of having decisions made together. And then obviously, what we look at here is a high level of control and a high level of support. So when we have high support and high control, that's really when we can work together with each other, those collaborative conversations. It seems small, and even one of the founders of Restorative, the IRP, talks about the fact that restorative practices is not rocket science, but it's these small micro movements that you catch yourself in the way that you address each other throughout the day that really have a big difference. Fair process, I'm going to skim over this one a little more quickly, but it's this idea, and this came from an article written by Kim in the Harvard Review. When we talk about fair process and getting people to buy in to decisions or changes, we get farther when we're able to engage people. So take a poll. So for me, engaging the child study team members as a family, maybe it's deciding what you're going to do that weekend. Engage them. What is everyone's hopes for this weekend? What would you like to do? You hear that, you take it into consideration, but then it's ultimately up to you as the parent to make the decision, and you provide then an explanation. I've heard what everyone has to say. This is what we're going to do this weekend. You know, so-and-so is going with this kid there, so-and-so is going with this kid here. And you provide that explanation and your expectations. And this is what we're going to do moving forward. But it goes back to that with box. We're calling our kids into the community of our family to feel like they have a voice. It's interesting because sometimes kids need explaining that just because they're engaged doesn't mean that it's a democracy. They don't get a vote, but we want to hear what you have to say. But ultimately, as a parent, we have to make the decision. But it's much different than a parent just saying, this is what our weekend's going to look like, boom, 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 and a kid feeling like they're helpless and out of control. So when you talk about kids with special needs and kids who have gone through trauma, or even adults who have gone through trauma, the more that they're able to feel a part of a conversation and share that control, the greater the outcome. The compass of shame. This was a game changer for me in terms of understanding my own kids' behavior and understanding behavior in general. And IRP defines shame in a little bit of a different way. So if you stick with me with this definition, it makes more global sense. But they define shame as any time a child has an interruption in joy. So if they're playing video games, if they're watching a movie, they're just on their phone, and you ask them to stop what they're doing to do something else, there's that interruption in joy. And oftentimes when there's that interruption in joy, their behavior comes out in different ways, and we always don't understand it. But when we look at the compass of shame, we can say that this manifestation of their behavior is for a few different reasons. Either it's, attacking and lashing out at other people, typically the person who interrupted their joy. They could withdraw, they could avoid things moving forward, or they could attack themselves. So someone mentioned IXL giving like the negative feedback, and then often kiddos are experiencing an interruption in their joy, and then they're attacking themselves. But understanding that the shame is not like this willful attack on you as a person, but it's because their joy was interrupted, and this is how they're expressing themselves. I'm working right now with our school counselors, overlaying this compass of shame. There are different therapeutic strategies that can be used to address individuals when they demonstrate their expression of shame in these ways. So it's really helpful. It almost creates, I don't want to say a formula, but almost a science behind, okay, this is the way you're acting out, and this is the approach we're going to take to address it. So for example, if someone's down here, expressing their shame by avoiding a situation and denying that it ever happened, well, maybe that's someone who needs a reality rub, and that's one of the strategies that we go over. And we do that by walking them through and recreating a timeline. So if this presentation is something that's helpful and from a parenting perspective, I'm happy to do a presentation on, it's called LSCI, Life Space Crisis Intervention, those different strategies that you could use to help support your kiddos. But it was just really interesting when I looked at how I express my shame, how each of my kids differently express their shame, and even how my wife does, because we all feel that. And then when we talk about restorative practices is also in state code. So how we operate as a school district, when kiddos have discipline, there's meant to be restorative interventions as well. So it's not just punitive and, again, pushing them out of community, but calling them back in. But restorative practices takes place on a continuum. We're not going to go in depth into all of these, but it goes from less formal to more formal. And what we'll talk about really here is more on the informal side, and we'll touch on circles briefly. But the first thing that you can do is use effective statements. This is a game changer in how you approach kids. It takes very little effort, but an incredible amount of mindfulness. And what we're talking about effective statements is, I'll use a school example. When I was at Park Ridge last year, there were 2 kids booking it down the hall at the junior senior high school. And the initial historical educational paradigm would have been to holler, like, hey, slow down in the hall. What are you guys doing? But instead, I quickly walked up to those 2 kids behind them after they turned the corner. I said, hey, do you all think you could help me out? I get really worried when I see you running down the hall because there are all these sets of stairs and there's a lot of kids, and I'm worried somebody could get hurt. Do you think you could help me out by going a little slower next time? Yeah, no problem, no problem. But we changed from talking about the behavior to talking about the way the behavior made me feel. So when we talk about effective statements, that's really, in the presentation, I can share these out. But think about times at home when you talk to kids. So often we are stressed. It's the end of the day. They're stressed from school. We're stressed from work and managing the house. That oftentimes we just talk about the behavior, the objective, what needs to be completed, right? You made your bed. Thanks for setting the table. Sometimes we talk about behavior in a not so positive light. But the key to the effective statements for restorative practices is, if you think of it like we're all sitting in a circle here today, and you think of it like a web. Do you remember that game that you used to play where they had the yarn and you toss it across the group from person to person and you'd end up with like this giant web at the end? The more you use effective statements, the more you're strengthening the bonds. So when you come home from work and maybe your kids miraculously set the table, thanks for setting the table. You're talking about the behavior. Erica, I am so proud that you thought enough about the family that you were able to get the table together for us. Like, that makes my life a lot easier. Thank you. We're saying the same thing. It's a small change, but when we talk about the way behavior makes us feel, that's pulling into community. And when we're dealing with a situation where there's less than positive behavior, we approach it in the same way. We're addressing the negative behavior, not the person, because we need to separate the doer from the deed. Whereas if we continue to talk about the bad behavior without separating the behavior from the person, that gets internalized and that pushes them out. So that small movement of the effective statements goes an incredibly long way. I started this program when Julia was like 2 or 3. And that was something that we were even able to work on with her in terms of how she talked to her brother and sister, because she's one tough cookie. As we move along this line, effective questions. This is the game changer. I'm not going to go through all of this. These are the restorative questions. So IERP has cards that staff keep in their IDs. And when there's an incident of harm that occurs, these are the questions we go through. And you'll notice the first one isn't, why'd you do that? It's, tell me what happened. And for the purposes of this meeting, I'm going to keep it pretty short at that, but you can see how this progresses. And the reason we ask, tell me what happened, is that allows an individual who caused or is the victim of harm to maintain their dignity. When you ask, why'd you do that? You strip them of their dignity. They're not going to talk to you and nothing productive is going to come of it. But if it's like, Raquel, can you talk to me? Like, what happened? You had a sub today in class. Tell me exactly what happened. They maintain their dignity. They can share their perspective. And the goal of restorative practices is not that we're always there as a parent to be a crutch, but to eventually develop autonomous, like self-healing humans and relationships when walking through these steps. Because you go through, tell me what happened. What were you thinking about? What have you thought about since? Who was affected? And what do you need to do to make things right? You notice I, as the parent, would not be telling you what to do. I'm asking you to think about it. And when we can eventually get our kids to think about these questions independently, they can self-heal and self-resolve issues without us. And the same thing if you're dealing with kids at home and one of them might have hurt the other, when you're going to the one who might have hurt the other person, it's, what did you think about? What impact did this have on your brother, your sister, or one of your partners? What's been hardest for you? And what do you think you need to make right? So then of both of these, we're talking about someone who's coming up with themselves of what they need to do to make it right. I think about this in the school setting. If there's a kid who's misbehaving in a classroom and the kid goes to the principal's office and the principal institutes a discipline. But maybe that's not what that teacher needed. There's some teachers who would be like, I just need an apology. There are going to be some teachers who are like, I just need 15 minutes to get my class back on track. All of the needs aren't the same because we're all different people coming with different experiences. So the more we can walk our kids through and even our spouses through when we harm each other, it's like, what do you need? What do you need to make things right? And the more we can use those effective questionings, the more we're able to heal, because we're able to provide healing that's meaningful. This is often used as restorative justice in terms of the criminal justice system. And you can imagine how that would also work, right? Because our legal system is broken in the sense that there's a crime done, there's someone harmed, you go to court, 2 lawyers speak, and a judge makes the decision, but these people have never resolved their issues. It's the issue I have with the Office of Administrative Law as well. If we had to go to trial as a district and a family, we go, oftentimes the 2 lawyers go in, talk for about an hour with the judge and come out and have reached some sort of agreement, but we've never gotten on the same page. I might have harmed you, I might feel harmed by you. We never have a moment to speak and to heal that relationship. So that's why I think this is so important. There's a beautiful article that's very, very old, but it talks about conflict, the ownership of conflict and how important that is. And when that's taken away from us, we're really robbing someone of the opportunity to solve it. So you can think about that within your family dynamics, whether you have multiple kids or kids with their friends. How do we encourage them to self-heal rather than making a decision that's done to or for them? When we do all this work, people are able to be accountable. They're able to come up with resolutions on their own. They have their dignity. And ultimately, we're strengthening relationships, because we've all probably had relationships where there's been conflict and we just like distance ourselves. But relationships get stronger when you can express that vulnerability, admitting your mistake and saying, how can I move forward to make this better? Small impromptu conferences is like doing that kind of work on the fly. And then when we talk about circles, circles would be considered more formal. There's a reason we get together in a circle. It's so we can all see each other, so we can all connect, and we honor everyone's individual experience. And you can think about the fact that you're like, well, Steve, how does this apply to my house? You know, when am I supposed to have a circle, like in the middle of my living room? If there's been a significant issue, yes, having a circle and getting together can be incredibly helpful to go through those effective statements, to go through those effective questions. Even just putting value and having a shared meal at the end of the day, like that's a built-in circle if you're all around the table together. There are different types of things that you can do in circles, but the idea is that everyone has a voice. It's not one person talking all the time. In our family, where we tried to prime for positivity, so it'll be like, tell me the best part of your day. What are you most looking forward to? And we go around and everyone has that shared voice. So when you use this to resolve conflict, you can also use this proactively. The biggest thing you can do when you have circles, and we do this as part of our staff, our special services committee, we'll have circles where we go around as the introduction and the closing. But the more that people feel like they have a voice in what's going on in their family or in their classroom, the more likely they are to feel represented and connected, and they're able to feel safer. When I was using circles as a teacher at Montclair State, I had students tell me, in higher education, like, we don't talk, we just come in, we sit, we take notes, we take a test, and we go home. And I had one student who was blind, and she met someone in the hallway of the school, and they said, oh yeah, we had class together last semester. And she said, I had no idea, because I couldn't see that person, and that person was never invited to speak. So by giving our kids a voice, even at a young age, to share what's happened, what they need to make things right, and what's of value to them, we can work on building community. It certainly happens when things go wrong, sitting the kids down and having that responsive circle as well. So you can use it for behavior. You can use it to deal with loss that happens or dangerous situations. If you're going together on a family trip, what are the expectations with this car ride? What are the expectations when we get to this amusement park today? What's something that might be dangerous that you shouldn't do? What should you do? But everyone gets to have a voice and speak, rather than like toning out mom or dad as we're driving. Like, okay, when we get to bounce you, absolutely no X, Y, or Z. It's inviting people into that space.
I have 2 allotments at the amusement
Right.
park. Oh
Yep.
my God.
So this idea that we trust in the circle, that problems are really just the opportunity to strengthen our relationship. And the more that we can do this work proactively, the better. Because if we don't have a relationship to begin with, it's really hard to resolve the conflict on the back end. And if you all decide you want to talk more about life-space crisis intervention, that gets more into also like the biology of the brain, right? They talk about the fact that when we're in trauma and we're triggered, the rational side of our brain shuts down, and we just need time to process. But when we come back together, we're able to process more with someone that we have a relationship with. And LSCI is incredible. It kind of overlays these foundational beliefs and talks about how we can utilize it moving forward. So why does all of this work? Because it strengthens our relationships. It creates a spirit of cooperation, responsibility, because, right, like the elopement you had over the summer, if you talked about it responsibly together, then your kids are speaking as terms of like, oh, well, I suggested that, so now I need to follow it. They feel respected, it increases self-esteem, and they feel like they matter. When we give kids voice in a classroom, and even within our family unit, their voice matters. This is just a quote I have up here, just about the fact that as a community, we're really short on those opportunities to get together and create community. With technology and text messages and everything, even our family communicates a lot. We have a group family thread now. I have 2 with phones. Sometimes we'll even text when dinner's ready. But having that time to get together and share and value, and everyone comes with a unique perspective. So the biggest takeaway that I urge for you as parents is to shift from that why to what happened. Tell me what happened here. Even when they've like dumped milk at the table, written on the wall with invisible ink and marked up your new sheetrock, whatever it is that happened, try to pull back that instinctive why. That why has nothing to do with them. The why is all about us as the caretaker. Like, we want the answer that's going to satisfy us and appease us, but it pushes them away. And in restorative practices, they have language, the difference between stigmatizing shame. The why is stigmatizing, but the what happened is reintegrative. Shame isn't a bad thing, but when we use it to reintegrate back into the community by asking what happened, that's strengthening the relationship. So I know we had a long meeting today. You all can feel free to reach out to me. There's resources online at the IRP. There's some wonderful books I could recommend. And I have some books back here as well if anyone wants to peruse. But just the idea that these practices could be used at home, at school, at your place of faith, wherever. It's just a matter of respecting and caring for each other as a way to resolve conflict through our connections and relationships. I will stop our recording there and take any questions.